I thought that by 62, I had already faced the worst life could throw at a man. I'd buried my father at 35, watched my mother fade slowly into dementia over 7 long years, and rebuilt my small accounting practice from nothing after the 2008 financial crisis nearly wiped me out. I'd earned my gray hair and my quiet Saturday mornings on the back veranda with a cup of tea and the sound of magpies in the gum trees. I thought I understood what hard looked like. I was wrong. My name is Graham Whitfield. I live, or at least I lived, for most of my adult life, in a brick veneer house, on a quiet street in Ballarat, Victoria. The kind of street where neighbors wave from their driveways and the council still plants flowering cherry trees along the footpath every spring. It was the kind of life that looked, from the outside, like everything a man could reasonably want. I had a wife of 23 years. I had a daughter at university in Melbourne. I had a business that kept us comfortable without making us rich. And on the evening of our wedding anniversary in April 2019, sitting across the table from my wife at the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first proper date back in 1996, I raised my glass and toasted to the next chapter. She smiled and clinked her glass against mine. What I didn't know was that she was already writing that next chapter, and I wasn't in it. My wife's name was Caroline. She was 51 when this story begins, tall and dark-haired, the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. She taught secondary school English in Ballarat for 20 years and was genuinely beloved by her students, thoughtful, warm, quick with a laugh. That was the version of Caroline I'd fallen in love with. That was the version I thought I knew. My closest friend, the man I'd known since we played under one-force footy together in Geelong, was a man named Derek Prowse. Derek had been best man at our wedding. He'd been there when our daughter was born. He'd sat with me in the hospital corridor the night my mother had her first major episode, said nothing, just handed me a thermos of tea and stayed until 2 a.m. When I thought of the word mate in the truest Australian sense of the word, I thought of Derek. He was also, as I would eventually discover, the man my wife had been seeing for almost 4 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first sign, looking back, was so small I would never have noticed it if I hadn't already started to wonder. It was a Tuesday evening in late August 2019. I came home from the office earlier than usual. A client had canceled and the house was quiet. Caroline's car was in the driveway, which was normal. What wasn't normal was that she didn't answer when I called out. I found her in the kitchen, phone face down on the bench, staring out the window at the back garden with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're home early," she said. Not warmly. More like someone recalibrating. "Client canceled," I said. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "Just tired." I thought nothing of it. Teachers get tired. It was late in term 3, always the longest stretch. I put the kettle on and asked about her day, and she answered in that perfectly normal way that leaves you with nothing to hold on to. It was only later, lying awake at midnight, that I remembered the way she'd turned the phone face down before I walked in. Not the screen-down habit of someone conserving battery, the deliberate single motion of someone managing something. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that for quite a few months. What changed things was a weekend in October. Derek had driven up from Geelong, as he did every couple of months. He and I had a standing arrangement Saturday afternoon at the footy club for the reserves game, then dinner somewhere unpretentious. Caroline usually joined for dinner. She and Derek had always gotten along easily, the way your wife and your best mate do when everyone genuinely likes each other. I'd always been grateful for that. That Saturday, I was running late getting back from a client emergency, a sole trader who'd managed to tangle himself magnificently with the ATO before a Monday deadline. I texted Derek to say I'd meet him at the ground. When I arrived, he and Caroline were already there, standing near the boundary fence. They were laughing about something. Nothing unusual, but as I walked toward them, Derek glanced up and saw me coming, and something shifted in his face. The laugh faded half a second too quickly. He straightened almost imperceptibly. He covered it immediately, Graham, mate, your missus has been keeping me company. She reckons the reserves are worse than ever this year. Caroline smiled. I said no such thing. Everything proceeded normally. We had dinner at a Thai place on Sturt Street. Derek was funny and generous, the same as always. Caroline was relaxed in a way she hadn't been in weeks. I drove home that night feeling almost silly for the faint unease sitting in my chest, but I didn't forget that half-second. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I've spent 30 years as an accountant, which means I deal in facts, in figures, in things that can be verified. I don't speculate. I don't catastrophize. When something doesn't add up, I look for the most reasonable explanation before I consider the dramatic one. That's how I approach this. Over the following 6 weeks, I paid quiet attention. I noticed that Caroline's phone now went with her everywhere, including the bathroom, which it hadn't before. I noticed that she'd started going to the gym on Thursday evenings, something new, and that she always showered there rather than at home. I noticed 2 occasions where she said she was staying back after school for parent-teacher meetings. And when I happened to mention it to a teacher colleague of hers at a community function, the colleague looked mildly confused and said, "Parent-teacher night wasn't until week 9. I noticed that whenever Derek's name came up in conversation, Caroline's response was calibrated. Not overly casual, not overly warm, just perfectly measured. The way someone responds when they've rehearsed the register of that response. I am an accountant. I know what a set of books looks like when someone has been managing them. I know the difference between an honest mistake and a deliberate adjustment. By November, I knew what I was looking at. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. What I did instead was make an appointment with a private investigator based in Melbourne, a firm I found through a lawyer colleague who handled family law. I felt profoundly strange making that call. Men like me, on streets like mine, don't hire private investigators. Or so I'd believed. The woman I spoke to was matter-of-fact, in a way that helped. She didn't make me feel foolish. She took the details and said her team would be in touch within the week. What they gave me 3 weeks later was thorough and devastating and completely unambiguous. I sat alone in my office on a Friday evening after the last staff member had gone home, and I went through the folder they'd sent. Photographs, timestamps, a summary of observed meetings over a 14-day period. Derek's car parked outside a serviced apartment in Geelong on 4 separate occasions. Caroline's car in the same location on 3 of those occasions. The 4th, she'd taken a taxi. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the night Derek sat with me in the hospital corridor. I thought about our wedding, his speech, the part where he'd said there was no better man he knew than me. I thought about every Christmas, every Easter, every long Sunday afternoon the 3 of us had spent together over 2 decades. I thought about my daughter, who called Derek uncle. And then I closed the folder, locked it in my desk drawer, and drove home. Caroline was making dinner. The house smelled like roast lamb, which had always been my favorite. "Good day?" she asked. "Quiet," I said. I helped set the table. We ate. We watched television. I went to bed and lay still beside her in the dark, listening to her breathing slow into sleep. And I thought very carefully about what came next. What came next took 4 months to prepare. I want you to understand something about this period. It is perhaps the loneliest thing I have ever done to continue living inside a life you know is constructed on deception. To smile at the right moments. To maintain the appearance of an ordinary marriage, while privately, methodically, and without a single moment of self-pity, you prepare for what needs to happen. I consulted a family lawyer in Melbourne. Not locally, I didn't want the news running through Ballarat the way news always does in a city that still thinks of itself as a town. I began quietly organizing my financial documentation. Our assets were modest by some standards. The house, 2 vehicles, my practice, a small investment portfolio. Superannuation on both sides. I made sure I understood the position of every single item. I told no one. Not my daughter. Not my brother in Brisbane. Not a soul. Derek called 3 times in those 4 months, his usual check-in calls, warm and ordinary. I answered each time. I asked about his life. I laughed at his jokes. Each time I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. And then I got on with things. Caroline, for her part, had become in some ways easier to live with during this period. More attentive. Occasionally affectionate. In a way she hadn't been in perhaps a year or 2. I understood, without any particular bitterness, that this was the behavior of someone managing their guilt. Someone who tells themselves that being kinder at home somehow balances the ledger elsewhere. It doesn't. But I said nothing. The evening I chose was a Saturday in late March 2020, 2 weeks after the first COVID lockdown announcements had turned the whole country sideways. We were at home, as everyone was. I'd made dinner pasta, something simple. I opened a good bottle of red that we'd been keeping for an occasion. Caroline commented on it. "What's the occasion?" "I thought we were due one," I said. We ate. We talked about our daughter, who was back home from Melbourne by then, staying with us through the lockdown. She'd gone to her room after dinner to call friends, which I'd quietly anticipated. I poured the last of the wine. I looked at my wife across the table, this woman I'd loved genuinely, for a very long time, and in some complicated, grief-stricken way, still did. And I said, quite calmly, "I need to talk to you about Derek." The color left her face so quickly it was almost clinical. "I know everything," I said. "I've known for 4 months. I've been to a lawyer. The finances are sorted, and I have documentation from an investigator that covers 14 months of what's been happening. I'm not angry. I'm not going to shout. But I need you to tell me how long it's actually been going on." She said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" "That's not the question I asked," I said. What followed was the hardest conversation of my life. Not because it was volatile, but because it wasn't. She didn't deny it. She didn't fabricate. She cried. Quietly. With a kind of exhausted relief that I think surprised even her. It had been going on for 4 years and 3 months. It had begun at a birthday gathering I'd thrown for Derek at our own house, which was a detail I chose not to examine too closely in the moment. She asked if there was anything that could be done. I said no. I said it without cruelty and without wavering. The divorce was finalized 14 months later. It was not a pleasant process, but it was not a war either. We divided things fairly. Caroline remained in the house initially and bought out my share 18 months later when she and Derek, yes, they continued made more permanent arrangements. I moved into a rented flat near the Ballarat Botanic Gardens while I decided what to do next. I told my daughter when it became unavoidable. That was the hardest conversation. Harder than the one with Caroline. Because my daughter had no framework for this. Derek was family to her. In every way that mattered. She didn't speak to her mother for 3 months. She didn't speak to Derek for much longer. I asked her not to let my situation become her war, which is advice she found difficult and which I understand completely. I told Derek in a single phone call. I said I knew that it was over and that I had nothing further to say to him. He started talking. I ended the call. That was the last time we spoke. I've been asked, since then, whether I regret not confronting him more directly, whether I wish I'd said more, done more, expressed the depth of what that betrayal meant. Honestly, no. There are things a man of 62 understands that a younger man might not. Derek already knew exactly what he'd done. Anything I said would have been for my benefit, not justice. And I was more interested in moving forward than in settling scores. What came next surprised me. I had prepared myself for a long period of grief, of quiet diminishment, of learning to fill time that used to be shared. To some extent, that's exactly what happened. The first winter in the flat near the gardens was genuinely hard. I cooked for one. I watched television I hadn't chosen. I learned to enjoy my own company again, the way I hadn't since my 30s, and I found it both more difficult and more rewarding than I'd expected. I joined a book club at the local library, something I would never have done when married, which said something, I supposed, about the small constrictions of a long partnership. The group met fortnightly on Wednesday evenings. 7 or 8 people, mostly retired. Occasionally a working person who came and went depending on the term. We read broadly. We argued pleasantly. I found I liked it enormously. It was through the book club that I met a woman named Patricia Nguyen. She was 58, Vietnamese Australian, recently retired from a career in hospital administration. She had a daughter in Sydney and a son in Perth. She'd been widowed 6 years earlier. Her husband had died of a cardiac event while they were on holiday in far north Queensland, sudden and without warning, and she'd navigated grief of a kind I hadn't experienced. Patricia was not what I'd expected to find. At 62, in a library book club in Ballarat, she was precise and funny and unexpectedly opinionated about 19th century literature. She challenged things I said in a way that made me think rather than making me defensive. She laughed at things that I found funny before I'd finished saying them, which is a rarer gift than people appreciate. We had coffee after the session one Wednesday in June. Then dinner the following month. Then, without any particular ceremony or declaration, we simply became part of each other's ordinary weeks. I don't want to overdress what Patricia and I found together, because I think that would do it a disservice. We are 2 people in our 60s who have both loved other people deeply and lost those loves in different ways. We know what grief looks like from the inside. We know our own flaws. We carry history that doesn't disappear. What we have is something quieter and more durable than the intensity of early life. We take long walks along Lake Wendouree on Sunday mornings. We cook for each other. We disagree about films and agree about books. When I wake at 3 in the morning, as men of my age sometimes do, and the old things surface, the memory of Derek's voice in the hospital corridor, the image of Caroline at that dinner table, the specific loneliness of those early months in the flat. Patricia's presence in the house is a solid and specific comfort. My daughter likes her. That matters enormously. My daughter is, in many ways, the person in this story I feel most, for she was collateral to a situation not of her making, and she handled it with a maturity that frankly humbled me. She and I are closer now than we were before all of this. There is something about shared difficulty, honestly faced, that does that. I've had time, in the 3.5 years since that dinner table conversation, to think about what I'd say to a man facing what I faced. Not advice, exactly. More like observations from the other side of it. The first is this. The instinct to ignore small signs is not stupidity. It's love. When you've spent 23 years building a life with another person, your mind actively resists the evidence that it's been compromised because the cost of being right is so catastrophic. I don't look back on those months of dismissing my own instincts with shame. I look back on them with some compassion for the man I was. The second is, there is a profound difference between revenge and resolution. I did not set out to hurt Caroline or Derek in return for what they did. What I set out to do was to extract myself, with my dignity and my finances intact, from a situation that was irretrievably broken. Those are different projects, and confusing them is costly. The anger is real, and it deserves space. But building your response around that anger tends to extend the damage rather than contain it. The third is harder to say. Some of what happened was mine to look at honestly. Not the infidelity that was their choice and their responsibility entirely, But a marriage doesn't hollow out overnight. I had been, in the years before this, genuinely absent in ways that I could and should have addressed. I was present physically and financially absent emotionally, which is its own kind of absence. I don't say this to excuse what Caroline did. I say it because, if there's a next chapter, and for me there is, I want to enter it with clear eyes. The fourth is something Patricia said to me once, on one of those Sunday walks, when I was asking some variation of the question that men of my age tend to ask when things have gone badly, whether it was all wasted, whether the years added up to nothing. She looked at me in the particular way she has, patient, direct, a little impatient with self-pity. And she said, "You're still here, Graham. The years brought you to here." What does wasted even mean? I've thought about that often. I think she's right. The years of that marriage produced my daughter, who is one of the finest human beings I know. They produced a community, a practice, a sense of place in a city I love. They produced a version of me that, having been tested, turned out to be someone I could respect. None of that is wasted. None of it gets unmade. There is a kind of wisdom that is simply not available to younger people. It cannot be taught or hurried. It comes only from having lived enough to understand that loss is not the end of the story. It is, if you're willing to do the work, the point at which the story finally becomes honest. I was 62 when my marriage ended. I am 65 now. Sitting on the veranda of a house Patricia and I bought together last year in a small town east of Ballarat, where the mornings are cold and clear and the wattlebirds argue in the grevilleus. I still run my practice, part-time. I still go to book club. I am, I think, genuinely and unsurprisingly content in a way that I was not during many years of what I mistook for happiness. That's not a small thing. In fact, I've come to believe it might be the main thing. Whatever road led you here, it brought you somewhere. The question worth asking, the only one, really is what you intend to do with the ground you're standing on. You said, "Dura vau noidung, dar vit en fantik." Prompt 1. Taur tiu de, Tom Nail. Mota de andu. Ex swat. Theo de go. On Thanksgiving, my wife announced she was pregnant.